Hello, welcome to Tales from the House. Today, the 22nd of April, our journey through time is a little bit more serious than it has been of late today. Let us begin in 1509 today, when Henry VIII became King of England. Now, we've all heard of Henry VIII, and if I can share my screen with you now, I'm sure that the image that comes to mind is this image here. Yes, indeed. That's the image that we have of him, this large, dominating, aggressive man looking out of the picture, overweight, tall, powerful, challenging you to defy him, because at this point in time, he's the ruler of everything. He's gotten rid of the Catholic Church, he runs Parliament, pretty much, and he's in complete control of the nation. And he's become a figure in Europe as well. But he wasn't always like this. The idea that Henry VIII is this big fat man is not really true until later on in his life. You see, when he was born, but when he was younger, he was, much less dominating, as you are when you're younger and you're less confident. And these early portraits of him present him as a much softer figure. He becomes king today in 1509 when he's 17 years old. Now, officially, you weren't supposed to until you were 18, but they just kind of ignored the rule. There's no need for a regent. He was going to be 18 in months. And he married his brother's wife, and they got round it with an annulment by saying that they hadn't actually consummated it because you couldn't marry your brother's wife. And I'm sure that you know the Reformation and everything that happens under Henry VIII all begins at that point. But he was considered to be quite the new sort of humanist ruler at the time. The bells rang out, everybody rejoiced. People wrote poems in his praise, and they thought this new, young, supremely athletic king who speaks several languages and is highly well-read and had debated Erasmus as a child in Latin is going to be great for the country. The first thing he does to improve his popularity is he executes his father's tax collectors. Bit brutal, great move, though, for popularity terms, but you can see right from the start the way that this man is going to operate. He was fantastically egotistical and was always seeking popularity, and people gradually learned that they must just be a sycophant to him and give it to him. Otherwise, all else would be lost. But he was a terrific athlete, and he was a top-class jouster, if we accept that other people didn't just let him win. He probably was supreme at indoor tennis. There's a report about him sweating and glowing in this athletic, manly way through the shirt as he wins the tennis at Hampton Court, written by a Venetian ambassador. And you can see his suit of armor here, which I think is in the Imperial War Museum. He was over 6 foot tall, 6'3", I think, and an enormous man, very compelling figure if he was to stand before you, and grew in authority throughout the reign. Didn't last, though. We all know how he ended up. He went down a bad way, and by 1547, he's 55 years old, and he dies an incredibly corpulent individual. And this is, I think, looks pretty old for a 50-odd-year-old, early 50s. So I think that looks pretty old by today's standard. Let me give you some idea of the shape he finished in, because he goes from being this young, incredible, popular athlete in all manners to being a complete disaster of a human being by 55. His waist was 54 inches. I mean, that's huge. He barely kept his waist below his age until he died. He was about 30 stone. 30 stone. He was so heavy that he was carried around in a sedan chair by 6 servants. And sometimes he had to be wheeled around. And for the last year of his reign, he was bedridden. This was an incredibly fat man. He also had difficulty walking, though, because he had an old jousting wound in his leg that had, for years, been ulcerous and would occasionally weep and seep with pus. Apparently you could smell it when you were close to him. So he ended up quite a sorry individual with a cane, having to be carried around in this stinking, pus-filled, weeping leg of a 30-stone individual. When he died, as he naturally did in 1547, his death was kept secret for 3 days because the heir to the throne was a 9-year-old Edward VI, and the leading nobles of the land wanted to secure power because a 9-year-old wasn't going to rule, someone was going to have to do it on their part. So his death is kept secret for 3 days. and he isn't buried for 2 weeks. And then when he is buried, he's transported in a lead-lined coffin to a temporary tomb in Windsor at St. George's Chapel. And it was only meant to be temporary. He had this magnificent tomb planned, marble plinth, black stone carved tomb, candles, jewels, 4 bronze angels on each side, and an enormous statue of him riding a horse. I mean, it's just amazingly egotistical. So where is this? Well, it doesn't exist, and I'll tell you why. Firstly, when he was being transported in this lead-lined coffin from London to Windsor, it took 2 days to transport him, and it's 2 weeks after his death. And being such an enormous man, his body had started to fester and stew, and they'd had to squash him into this lead casket because he was so fat. And in the course of the journey, being bumped about, all the gases and things had caused Henry VIII's body to explode inside this lead coffin. And as they stopped for the night, somebody noticed that the seam in one of the coffins was leaking blood, pus, and bodily juices, and so they called a local solderer in to to seal up the lead tomb and the crack, but not before a couple of dogs had started licking the blood and pus of the dripping corpse of Henry VIII off the floor. This is just a terrible way for a man with such an ego to end. In any case, the next day he arrives at St. George's Chapel, and he's buried there, and I think you can still see that he's buried there if you were to go to Windsor and go into St. George's Chapel. He's buried there with his wife and Henry himself, and oddly, Charles I, the beheaded King of England 100 years later. Well, how did this happen? He wasn't supposed to be buried there. It was just temporary. And everybody after him kind of said, yes, we'll go on with his tomb. But he had left the state bankrupt, and it was not a priority. So his magnificent tomb I was describing to you never got built. And so the most egotistical king of the age has one of the least opulent burial sites. He remains in his temporary position. In 1813, when they were excavating under Windsor, trying to make a passage for something or other, they came across this forgotten tomb, and this was the watercolor that was drawn by the people who came across it. On the middle there is Henry VIII's lead coffin that had to be resealed, that he'd exploded inside. And on the right is his wife, his favourite wife, Jane Seymour. Favourite because she'd done what was expected. He'd give him a son and then die and get out of the way so he can get on with his fancy pantsing around. So they got buried together, supposed to be only temporary. And then 100 years later, in 1649, so this is 47 he dies, 1649, they reopened the tomb and put the beheaded Charles I body in there, and that's the darker coffin on the left. And then it was forgotten about until 1815, when they came across this. And I guess they resealed it because they didn't move him to any opulent tomb that was created. No. So what happened? Because some of these things had existed. Some of these things were planned to be Cardinal Wolsey's tomb, but obviously when he's disgraced, it gets seized. So the black stone coffin, which is really rather opulent, was used round about this time to bury Lord Nelson in a tomb in St. Paul's Cathedral. So if you ever go there and see that, that was built, that black stone tomb was carved in preparation for Wolsey, was then confiscated by Henry VIII to be his own tomb, and you got a marble plinth and the black stone coffin. That was supposed to be where Henry VIII was buried, but it wasn't. And now it's been used for Horatio Nelson's body. Much better purpose, I think. And then 2 of the bronze angels turned up at an auction in the continent, I think, and 2 more were discovered at a country house. All 4 of them have been bought and put back together for £5 million. In 2015 they were bought, and they're in the Victoria and Albert Museum, so you could go and see them there. So Henry VIII's tomb is kind of around in bits and pieces, but he's not in it. He remains in that simple grave in St. George's Chapel in Windsor. There you are. Henry VIII today became King of England, and he was a fine fellow when he did, but he killed the taxpayers. That was the tax collectors. That was the first thing he did, and that kind of sets a tone for the rest of his reign. And he ended in that terrible fashion and remains in a temporary grave in St. George's Chapel. All right. Next item today is the very first use of gas in World War I, poison gas. This gas was first deployed in 1915 today by the German army against the French. Now, you could debate whether it's the first use, because people had used tear gas before this, but in combat this is poison gas. And the Germans had tried to use it earlier in 1915 on the Eastern Front against the Russians, but when they fired it, the gas had all frozen. Now, the Russians say that about 1,000 people had died, but other reports say that the gas was ineffective because it froze. But what we do know on the Western Front, that the first effective use of gas was today in 1915. Across a 4-mile front, they released the gas, as you can see here, in a headwind, in a wind. So the wind was simply to blow the gas across the trenches on a 4-mile stretch. And that's what happened. Now, the French line did not have any clue what was going on. The usual tactics were a prolonged bombardment of the trenches, and you would go and hide in your dugouts. And then when it stopped, you had to make sure it stopped, and it wasn't a trick to get you out and then bombard again. But when it stopped, it was then a race to get back to your positions to stop the attacking army across no man's land. So on this day, the usual occurrence happened, the bombardment of the French lines. And when it stopped, the French tried to get back to their positions to wait for the first wave, to beat the first wave of the German advance. But it never came. Instead, across a 4-mile front, the battlefield was filled with this white rolling mist. And they just did not know what to expect. This was, what was going on here. And it was only when this white rolling mist flew into their trenches that people started to choke and suffer. This was chlorine gas. Now, if you've been in a swimming pool as a child and stayed in there too long without goggles, then you know that chlorine can burn the eyes. And that's really, really diluted chlorine. This was pure chlorine gas. And it made you temporarily blinded. It was incredibly painful. It burned the throat. And the lungs, and put you out of action. And it had an astonishing effect. It decimated 2 French divisions, 2 French regiments, 2 French divisions, and an Algerian division in the line at this point in time. The trench front, was breached for the first time ever on such a scale. But the Germans were as surprised as the French by the outcome and were unprepared to take advantage. Apart from that, they had to then go to the place where the gas was, so that they kind of couldn't. So the weapon itself is somewhat flawed. And then gases developed, and people had to try to figure out how to defend against it. There were different types of gases. And usually the development was make a gas, make a defense, make a better gas, make a better defense, and that's how it went. To begin with, it attacked the eyes and the breathing system. And then they developed phosgene gas, which was 600 times more powerful. And that actually, when you breathe it, dissolved your lungs, and you would drown in your own dissolving lung fluid. I think there's a poem by one of the war poets that talks about that horrible gurgling, retching sound in the lungs that someone, it's awful. But you had an initial defense like this. And if you know any basic sort of science, you know that you cancel out an acid with an alkali and vice versa. So they did what they could before any defenses were made. They took great cloths or socks or linen or whatever it was, and they went to the end of the trench where you had a bucket, a communal bucket for people to pee in, and they soaked it in urine, the communal urine, and they held that and breathed through it. And yes, they breathed in droplets of everyone's pee, but that's preferable to suffering the choking and dissolving effects of chlorine gas. Obviously, this means that you have to then develop a gas mask, and they did develop gas masks. They basically developed these sorts of things, which was a hood with a pipe on, and the pipe went into a box, which you can't see here. And in the box, they had different sorts of layers of stuff, different layers of material, and each one a different type of thickness and gauze and make, and covered in a different sort of material, so that you breathe through it. And that would hopefully purify the air. It probably tasted terrible, but it purified the air and survived. It is a short step from there to decide, hey, do you know what? This is a colorized French figure. Do you know what? Actually, we can do away with the pipe and the box around here. We just stick the box on the end of the gas mask, and that's how we end up where we are today. So they had to develop more powerful gases, and because gas masks and defenses developed so quickly and so well, you end up with a third development of gas, which is mustard gas, which you can see. Now, chlorine was white and you could see it in the first attack. Phosgene you couldn't, and was more powerful and dissolved the lungs. So people would keep birds in the trench, or as soon as one person starts to choke on the chlorine gas, everyone puts it on. I mean, you can't get very far with that. So they went back to, they developed mustard gas, which you could see, and was a sort of green color of the mustard seeds. Well, why go back from an invisible gas to a colored gas? Because this also attacked the skin. Any skin, as well as the breathing and the eyes, any skin would be blistered and burned. The whole object here is either to kill or put men out of the war to give you an advantage. But the invention of the gas mask and protective clothing happened so rapidly on the back of all of these that it wasn't really very effective. Now, about 500,000 troops were injured by gas. And when you consider that 1/3 of all of the shells fired were gas shells, they don't always release them in the wind, and only 30,000 soldiers were killed through gas. That might seem a lot, but when you consider that 9 million soldiers were killed in the war, you can see how ineffective gas actually ends up being. There were lots of easy defenses. Like I say, a canary would die first, and you would be warned. Everybody gets issued with a gas mask. You can put them on when one person starts to die. Then others protect themselves. You can see it coming. And there were even simpler things. They would have a load of firewood in front of the trench, so that if you saw mustard gas coming, you could light the firewood. And as hot air rises, it would take the gas over the trench and behind you and suck in from there cool air, fresh air that will, give you time to prepare and defend. It also means that even if you're firing a shell on a non-windy day, that the gas kind of sits there and stays in the enemy trenches, making it hard for you to attack and take those places. So gas doesn't really prove to be a very effective weapon. A terrible weapon, nonetheless, first used today by the German army on the French in 1915, but all sides started to use it after that. We end up with the Geneva Protocol in 1925, where everybody agrees that we're not going to use gas attacks and chemical weapons in warfare. The Geneva Protocol said you could still develop them and you could still stockpile them. Why? I don't know, but there we are. And there's always the question about, well, why didn't people use it in World War II, particularly the Nazis, who seem to care so little for any sort of international agreement? Why didn't they use it on the battlefield? Because it's a different type of war. Gas, could have worked if it wasn't for the swiftness of defense, because World War I was very static and armies are in one place, so you can attack them with a gas. You get to World War II and you've got a very rapid lightning warfare of movement, and gas is just not effective because you can move away from the gas very quickly. So it's not a useful weapon. Apart from that, like I said, defense of gas was carried by everybody in a gas mask and was incredibly effective. So it isn't that they were respecting anything, because we all know the Nazis did use gas on an enormous scale to murder all of the Jews in the Holocaust camps. But it's not a useful weapon, particularly for war, unless that enemy is static. So you have seen in recent times chemical attacks on cities that are hemmed in, like in Syria and in Iraq, those sorts of places, domestic populations. But it didn't end there either. The British used gas, defoliant, in the 1950s in Malaya, and the Americans used it on a grand scale with Agent Orange in the Vietnam War. I can show you some pictures of the effects of Agent Orange, but frankly, the result on births and deformities is far too disturbing and really doesn't need to be looked at. You just have to take my word for it. But there you are, the first chemical weapons attack today, 1915, in World War I, and a sobering topic for us today. Moving on to our last topic today, if at all possible, this is, even worse, I think. We're going to talk about Haiti's first new president in about 14 years. 1971 today, Haiti gets a new president because this guy is dead. Francois Duvalier, better known as Papa Doc Duvalier. He had been elected in 1957 and he died in 1971. Called Papa Doc because he was a US trained doctor and he had worked in disease control. He was considered an educated man. He'd read Kemal Ataturk, he'd read Machiavelli, and he'd held some government posts before. But he wins the 57 presidential election, and we should have really understood what sort of a person he was going to be, a bit like the early signs that Henry VIII had. There was reports of voter intimidation, and the votes in some districts that supported him were in excess of the actual number of people who were able to vote. Yet the result was able to stand. He'd also, in the election, pursued a very divisive racial campaign. Now, traditionally, you had what was termed a mulatto class, which was a mixed race class, sort of black, the product of ancestral left behinds of white and black people living together, having children together. And so you had this class who were not sole black Africans, who had been educated, privileged, and were wealthy, and they ruled. This so-called mulatto class ruled Haiti. And Papa Doc Duvalier won his campaign by saying the vast overwhelming majority of people are poor, black, of African descent, and basically we want to kick out the mulatto, we want to run the country ourselves. And it proved a popular message. So he has this sort of racial campaign, and there's voter intimidation, and I think that gives us a hint as to what this man is going to be like. And I don't know if you know much about him, but he's genuinely an horrific figure. He, first of all, upon becoming president, exiled all his opponents and tried to kick out and shut down the Catholic Church. He wants total control. And if I can give you some idea of what he's like, he styled himself through voodoo on the image of Baron Samedi. And there was talk that, he was a bit like the Walking Dead. He was stone cold. He had a slight stoop. He had a soft voice, but he was very calm and measured. I mean, what you can't see about this photograph is the complete paranoia that the man had and the violence that he carried with him, because he sat there with his hand on a gun in the very same car. And he traveled everywhere like that. But he styled himself, like I said, on Baron Samedi, playing on the poor, ill-educated, illiterate, ancient views of voodoo in Haiti. And yes, I've got a picture of James Bond here because it plays on all that. And I'm sure if you've heard of Baron Samedi, it'll be because you've seen this guy in the film Live and Let Die. This is supposed to be Baron Samedi, who is the top-hatted voodoo spirit of the dead. There you are. Bit of Bond for you again. And that's who Duvalier styles himself on. So he's often in public wearing this hat, wearing black, being stone-faced, not touching people. And he took this idea of rule and voodoo really, really far. There are rumors that he reads goat's entrails in the palace. There is a special room in the presidential palace in Haiti where he had invited malignant spirits to live and reside to assist him in his role. It's just quite bizarre stuff. He quickly became paranoid and retreated into this sort of voodoo for his rule. His paranoia is genuine. A year after being elected, there had been some military rebels who'd tried to land and take over. They'd been defeated. He'd had a heart attack and left one of the leaders of the army in charge, and they had also tried to take over. So his paranoia is based on something genuine. And instead of the army, he decided to create the Tonton Macoute, which is Haitian Creole for bogeymen. And the Tonton Macoute were gradually increased in numbers, and they were basically personal bodyguards of Papa Doc Duvalier. And he made it 35,000 strong, larger than the official Haitian army. Their job was simply to root out any dissenters. They had free rein to arrest, kidnap, torture, kill, rape anybody who they felt they had even the slightest bit of evidence against was anti-Papa Doc Duvalier. Well, you can imagine that we're into some sort of lawless nation now that's ruled by some sort of brutal dictator, and that indeed is precisely what happens. He became pretty violent. There was a Tonton Macoute torture chamber within the presidential palace, and Duvalier liked to go to watch the torturing there because he wanted to absorb the spirit of the people being killed at the point of their death. And he had peepholes in several of the torture rooms so that he could go and watch whenever he felt like it. It's an incredibly corrupt state. 50% of all Haitian budget went to promoting and funding either the president, Papa Doc Duvalier, or the Tonton Macoute. And the rest of the nation, 90% of whom are illiterate, is just left in complete poverty. All external aid, about $15 million a year from the US until 1961, and the rest from other places, pretty much personally went to him. And it gets even more bizarre because he became so obsessed with voodoo cult and ritual that he decided that his lucky number was 22, and he would never leave the presidential palace except on the 22nd of every month. And he put a curse on all his enemies, including JFK. He was naturally delighted when JFK died on the 22nd of November in 1963, because he said, oh, well, that was me. And he used it in his country as proof of his voodoo powers. And you can imagine it just, his reputation grew. But today we have a new president. Despite electing himself president for life, his life ended. And today Haiti got a new president, his son, Baby Doc Duvalier, who ruled for a decade, also with the help of the Tonton Macoute. And if you wonder why Haiti is in such a state still today, well, that regime takes a lot of recovery from. That's your lot. Some sobering but serious and amazing topics today. The 22nd of April, Henry VIII assumes the throne and executes his father's tax collectors. Chemical warfare begins with the Germans using chlorine gas for the first time against French divisions on the Western Front. And Haiti has a new president because Papa Doc Duvalier, the crazed voodoo lord of the dead, has gone and his son is now in rule. That's your lot. I'll see you all tomorrow. And don't forget that you can subscribe down here, and you can see yesterday's efforts if you click on the link to the other side. And I'll see you all tomorrow. Have a really good time and take care.